Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You've handed us a fascinating challenge this time to explore what it means to act as philosophers through the lens of comparative philosophy of religion.
Hmm.
We've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on this topic as our main source. And trust me, there are some real gems in here that shed light on how looking at different traditions can sharpen our own philosophical thinking.
Absolutely. What's particularly compelling about comparative philosophy of religion, as this entry lays out, is that it's not just about, cataloging different religious beliefs.
Right.
It's a very specific way of approaching philosophical questions, one that insists on looking across diverse systems of thought to gain a richer, more nuanced understanding. It's almost like philosophy itself becomes more insightful when it sort of travels and encounters different landscapes of thought.
Right. So our mission here is to understand how engaging with this field of comparative philosophy of religion can help us all act as philosophers more effectively. This field, as the entry emphasizes, is fundamentally about understanding different ways of tackling those big fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got these two main angles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Comparing different religions from a philosophical perspective, and then comparing the different philosophies that people have about religion. It's like peeling back layers of thought.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that even the distinction between a religious idea and a philosophical idea about religion isn't always clear-cut.
Ah,
Think about figures like Saqqara in India or Thomas Aquinas in Europe. When we analyze their work, are we dealing with religious dogma or philosophical theology? The lines blur, and that blurring itself tells us something important about how these traditions developed.
which brings us to this powerful quote right at the beginning of the entry from Friedrich Max Müller, who knows one, knows none. It's about the study of religion, but it resonates so deeply with the idea of acting philosophically. It suggests that you can't truly grasp the essence of something, be it religion or a philosophical concept, by looking at it in isolation. You need that comparative perspective to get a broader, more informed view.
Exactly. And the entry extends this to philosophy of religion, arguing that to really understand the phenomenon of religion philosophically, not just one particular faith, but the very idea of religious belief and practice comparison is absolutely essential. In fact, it even mentions the idea that all philosophy is comparative philosophy. That really makes you think about how much our understanding is shaped by the contrasts and similarities we perceive.
Okay, so how are we going to navigate this intellectual terrain today? What are the key points we'll be exploring in this deep dive to help us understand this idea of acting as philosophers through comparison?
Well, we'll start by getting a clearer definition of what comparative philosophy of religion actually entails, along with some related terms that help us map the field. Then we'll journey back in time a bit, see how philosophers throughout history, even before the field had its current name, were already engaging in comparative work. We'll look at the important role of dialogue as a method for bringing different perspectives into conversation.
Right.
We'll then examine how modern European thinkers grappled with these issues, followed by a look at the diverse and sophisticated approaches that have emerged in the 20th and 21st centuries. We'll also explore the different ways philosophers either try to find common ground across traditions or, conversely, emphasize their distinct differences. And finally, we'll touch on how this comparative approach is applied to specific philosophical questions and consider some of the inherent challenges in doing this kind of work.
Sounds like a comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning. When we talk about comparative philosophy of religion, what are the different ways we can understand that term?
Okay, the entry really emphasizes two main interpretations.
Yeah.
First, drawing on Franklin Gamwell's definition, it's about critically examining the similarities and differences among religious activities themselves.
Okay. What are the fundamental characteristics that seem to define what we call religion across various cultures and traditions? Think of it as looking at rituals in different faiths or belief systems and trying to identify overarching patterns or key points of divergence.
So it's about looking at the actual practices and beliefs of different religions and trying to find those common threads or those really distinctive elements.
Precisely. And the second meaning, highlighted by Timothy Knepper, focuses on the comparative study of different philosophies of religion.
Ah.
This is more about examining how different intellectual traditions, whether they're from East Asia, South Asia, Europe, or elsewhere, have philosophically engaged with the concept of religion itself.
Ah. So it's not just comparing, say, Christian and Buddhist views on suffering, but also comparing how Confucian philosophy approaches the idea of the sacred compared to, let's say, contemporary analytic philosophy in the West.
Exactly. And as we touched on earlier, the boundary between these two isn't always sharp.
The entry uses Saqqara and Aquinas as an example again. When we compare their ideas about ultimate reality, are we analyzing religious doctrines or philosophical arguments about those doctrines? Often it's deeply intertwined. As Victoria Harrison points out, philosophy and religious ideas have a long history of mutual influence across the globe.
And it's really interesting that the entry brings up the argument that this whole separation of religion and philosophy might even be a relatively recent development, a product of European modernity.
That's a crucial point, attributed to scholars like Howard and King. The very categories we use to understand these different ways of thinking might be shaped by a specific historical and cultural context. So when we act as philosophers in a comparative mode, we need to be aware of the potential biases embedded in our own conceptual frameworks.
Right, so comparing isn't just about lining up neatly labeled boxes of religion A and philosophy B, because those labels themselves might not translate perfectly across different cultures and historical periods.
Precisely. The entry also notes that while comparative philosophy of religion often involves looking across different traditions, leading to terms like cross-cultural or intercultural philosophy of religion, it can also happen within a single tradition. Comparing the ideas of Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd within Islamic philosophy is a good example of that.
That makes perfect sense. Even within a shared religious or philosophical framework, there can be significant differences in how thinkers approach fundamental questions. Now, the entry also touches on descriptive versus normative approaches. Could you break down that distinction for us?
Sure. This distinction concerns the aim of the comparison. A descriptive approach focuses on carefully outlining and classifying the similarities and differences between religious or philosophical ideas without necessarily making judgments about which is better or truer.
Okay.
It's more about mapping the intellectual landscape. A normative approach, on the other hand, goes further and actively seeks to evaluate truth claims, identify superior arguments, or even construct new philosophical positions based on the comparative analysis.
So, one is more about understanding what is across different systems of thought, and the other is about trying to determine what we should believe based on that broader understanding.
That's a clear way to put it. Interestingly, the entry points out that while the term cross-cultural philosophy of religion has sometimes been associated with normative aims,
Right.
comparative philosophy of religion itself isn't exclusively descriptive. Philosophers using a comparative approach can certainly engage in evaluative and constructive work as well.
And then there's this idea of dialogue rather than comparison.
Right.
That sounds like a really important nuance in how we act as philosophers when engaging with different perspectives. What's the core of that idea?
Yeah, this perspective, championed by Raimundo Panikkar, raises a critical point about the inherent nature of comparison. Panikkar worried that comparison often implies a detached, neutral observer who can objectively assess different viewpoints. He argued that such a neutral stance is simply not possible when we're dealing with deeply held beliefs and fundamental worldviews.
So the very act of stepping back to compare might inadvertently create a sense of separation or even judgment, even if that's not our conscious intention.
That's the concern. Panikkar advocated for a more direct encounter or dialogue between different perspectives, treating each as an equal partner in the exchange.
Okay.
He distinguished between dialectical dialogue, which proceeds through logical reasoning and argumentation, and a deeper dialogical dialogue, which focuses on truly understanding the other person, their lived experience, and their underlying assumptions. The goal is mutual enrichment and understanding without necessarily trying to find a single unified truth or erasing genuine differences. This feels very much in line with the idea of acting as philosophers with humility and openness.
It sounds like a more empathetic and less adversarial way of engaging with different perspectives. Even when we're reading ancient texts or ideas from vastly different cultures, we can approach them as participants in an ongoing global conversation, rather than as objects of detached analysis.
Exactly. And as the entry mentions, thinkers like Hapfast and Clayton have tried to embody this dialogical spirit in their own work by constructing these imaginary conversations between major thinkers from different traditions, inviting the reader into that space of intellectual exchange.
Okay, so that gives us a solid foundation for understanding what comparative philosophy of religion is all about and how it informs the way we act as philosophers.
Yeah.
Now let's travel back in time. Were ancient philosophers already engaging in this kind of comparative thinking, even if they didn't have this specific label for it?
Oh, absolutely. The entry makes a strong case that the roots of philosophy of religion, including its comparative dimension, stretch way back to antiquity.
Okay.
Consider the early philosophers in Greece, India, and China. Their philosophical inquiries were often deeply interwoven with religious ideas and practices aimed at self-cultivation. The boundaries we draw so distinctly today between philosophy and religion were much more fluid in those early periods.
So, in a sense, they're acting as philosophers, naturally involved engaging with the religious and spiritual ideas of their time and other traditions they encountered.
Precisely. And we see a clear comparative element in the early doxographies. Now, for our listener, a doxography is essentially a historical overview or summary of philosophical doctrines.
Right, like a catalog of ideas.
Yeah, exactly. The entry describes it as a text that systematically presents the key ideas of different philosophers or schools of thought.
So it's like these early scholars were creating the original compare and contrast essays of philosophical thinking. These texts we call doxographies.
Exactly. And these weren't limited to ancient Greece and Rome. We also find them in medieval India, across Brahmanical, Buddhist, and Jain traditions.
Wow.
Given the close relationship between philosophy and religion in these contexts, these doxographies often function as early forms of comparative philosophy of religion. They would present different viewpoints side by side, sometimes with the aim of arguing for the superiority of one, but also simply to highlight the similarities and differences between them.
Can you give us a few specific examples to illustrate how this worked?
Sure. In the Greco-Roman world, we have Cicero's De Natura Deorum, which is a dialogue featuring representatives of Epicureanism, Stoicism, and Skepticism, discussing their theological views.
Okay.
Clement of Alexandria's Stromates is another example where Christian themes are explored in relation to the ideas of various Greek thinkers. Then in India, you have works like Bhaviveka's Madhyamaka Hudyakarika, Harifadra's Adarshana Samukaya, and the Sarvasiddhanta Sagra, which is attributed to Sokara.
It's fascinating to imagine these early attempts to map out the landscape of different beliefs and philosophical positions. The entry even suggests that some of the Indian doxographies might have had a soteriological purpose,
Yes.
that by engaging with this comparative overview, the reader could potentially elevate their own understanding and move closer to spiritual liberation. That really reframes how we might see these texts. They weren't just academic exercises.
Exactly. They were potentially tools for intellectual and spiritual growth, demonstrating how acting as philosophers, in a comparative way, could contribute to a deeper understanding of oneself and the world.
And it seems like the dialogue form itself has been a persistent method for engaging in this kind of comparison throughout history, both in European and Indian traditions. What makes dialogue such a powerful tool for exploring different philosophical perspectives?
Well, dialogue inherently creates a space where different viewpoints can be directly juxtaposed and examined in relation to one another.
Right.
You see arguments unfold, points of agreement and disagreement emerge, and the nuances of each position become clearer through the interaction. It kind of mirrors how we often refine our own thinking through conversation and debate, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The entry provides some excellent Indian examples, like the philosophical exchanges between Gargi and Yajnavalkya in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the dialogues between the Buddha and Sutandat in the Digha Nikaya, and the discussions between Sulabha and King Janaka in the Mahabharata.
Mm.
Each of these highlights different philosophical points through the back and forth of conversation.
Precisely. In the dialogue between Gargi and Yajnavalkya, for instance, Gargi relentlessly questions Yajnavalkya about the ultimate ground of reality, pushing him to articulate increasingly subtle understandings.
Wow.
In the conversation with Sudalaka, the Buddha challenges the traditional Brahminical view of status based on birth rather than conduct, and Sulabha's dialogue with King Janaka explores the different paths to spiritual liberation. These examples show how acting as philosophers through dialogue was a way to rigorously examine fundamental ideas.
And the entry makes an important distinction between different kinds of dialogues. Some are more didactic, aimed at demonstrating the superiority of one viewpoint, like in some of Plato's dialogues where Socrates often seems to lead his interlocutors to a predetermined conclusion.
Right, where Socrates often functions almost as a mouthpiece for Plato's own philosophical positions.
But then there are the more contemplative or impartial dialogues, like Cicero's De Natura Deorum or Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion.
Yes.
The entry suggests these are more even-handed and invite the reader to continue the philosophical inquiry themselves. This seems to embody a more open-ended approach to acting as philosophers.
Exactly. These dialogues aren't necessarily about presenting a definitive answer, but rather about exploring different facets of a complex question and encouraging ongoing reflection and critical thinking in the reader. Clayton describes this style as an invitation to a conversation that is projected beyond the text.
So these ancient dialogues were already a sophisticated form of acting as philosophers by engaging with diverse perspectives and prompting further intellectual exploration. Now let's jump forward to modern Europe. The entry argues that thinkers like Hume, Kant, and Hegel were pivotal in modern philosophy of religion and employed comparative approaches in their work. That's an interesting point. I don't immediately categorize them as primarily comparative philosophers.
Yeah, it's maybe not the first label that springs to mind, but David Tracy makes a compelling argument that each of them, in their own way, engaged with religious and philosophical ideas that extended beyond their immediate European intellectual context.
Okay.
For Hume, this is quite evident in the natural history of religion, where he develops a kind of naturalistic account of the origins and evolution of religious belief by examining different forms of polytheism and monotheism. And even the dialogical structure of his dialogues concerning natural religion brings different arguments for and against the existence of God into conversation through his characters, implicitly inviting a comparative evaluation.
So by presenting these contrasting viewpoints in dialogue form, Hume was essentially asking his readers to engage in a comparative assessment of those arguments, encouraging them to act as philosophers themselves.
Precisely. For Kant, Tracy highlights his lectures on Eastern religions, his interest in accounts from travelers, and his assertion in Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone that his analysis of religion had a universal scope, even though his primary focus was on elucidating the rational core of Christian morality. So, while his engagement with non-Christian traditions might not have been essential, there was a definite comparative impulse in his thinking about the nature of religion itself.
So Kant's comparative interest might have been more about finding universal structures of reason that underlie all religious experience, rather than a deep dive into the specificities of different traditions for their own sake.
That's a fair assessment, I think. And then we come to Hegel, with his grand philosophical system and his concept of Christianity as the consummate religion.
Right.
His lectures on the philosophy of religion do involve a comparative survey of various world religions, including Buddhism, Hinduism, and Judaism, which he categorizes within his typology of determinate religion.
The entry acknowledges Hegel as a groundbreaking figure in bringing a comparative perspective to the study of religion, but also points out some significant limitations in his approach,
Yes.
such as his tendency to overlook historical context and internal diversity within these traditions. So his acting as a philosopher in a comparative mode was very much shaped by his own overarching philosophical framework.
Exactly. While Hegel's work was pioneering in some ways, his comparative analysis was often driven by his own philosophical agenda and his vision of historical progress. Definitely some limitations there.
Now, as we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, it sounds like comparative philosophy of religion really solidified as a distinct field of inquiry, with a much more explicit and central focus on cross-cultural engagement and a more deliberate effort to act as philosophers in a truly comparative way.
Yeah, it really did.
The entry mentions a range of influential figures with diverse approaches.
It did. Thinkers like Nishida Kitaro, Sri Aurobindo, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, and Ninian Smart represent a significant shift towards a more direct and sustained engagement with philosophical and religious ideas from across the globe.
Let's explore some of their contributions. Nishida Kitaro, this independent Japanese philosopher who drew deeply from both Eastern and Western thought. His concepts of absolute nothingness and the absolute present, linked to Zen Kensho, sound particularly relevant to understanding different ways of experiencing reality philosophically.
They are. Nishida sought to forge a unique philosophical path that wasn't simply a synthesis of East and West, but something genuinely new. His concept of absolute nothingness isn't just, emptiness, but a dynamic, creative ground of being. And his idea of the absolute present emphasizes the immediacy and lived quality of experience, connecting with Zen insights into the present moment. His work exemplifies acting as a philosopher by creatively drawing on diverse traditions to develop original insights.
And then there's Sri Aurobindo, with his vision of integrating Western materialism and Eastern spirituality through his integral yoga and integral philosophy.
Right.
He saw this synthesis as essential for understanding the full scope of reality, both the material and the spiritual, encouraging a more holistic way of acting as philosophers.
Absolutely. Aurobindo aimed to bridge what he perceived as a fundamental divide between the Western emphasis on the material world and the Eastern focus on the spiritual. He even drew parallels between the Hindu concept of supreme Brahman and the Western philosophical idea of the absolute, arguing for a deeper unity underlying these different conceptualizations. His philosophy emphasizes inner transformation as a key aspect of philosophical understanding.
Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, as both a philosopher and a politician, advocated for a view of religious experience as being fundamentally shaped by the individual perceiver, suggesting a kind of underlying unity across different religious traditions while also highlighting the significance of Advaita Vedanta.
Mhm.
His work seems to embody acting as a philosopher by seeking common ground while acknowledging distinct perspectives.
Yes, Radhakrishnan argued that the core religious experience is often the same, even if it's expressed through different cultural and doctrinal lenses. While he saw certain equality among major religions, he also considered Advaita Vedanta to offer a particularly profound articulation of this underlying reality. His efforts to bridge Eastern and Western thought were significant in promoting intercultural understanding.
And Ninian Smart, he seems like a pivotal figure in really establishing comparative philosophy of religion as a more systematic and rigorous field.
Oh, definitely.
His phenomenological method of bracketing truth claims, his multidimensional analysis of religion, and his broader framework of philosophy of worldviews all point to a very comprehensive and nuanced way of acting as philosophers, comparatively.
Smart was incredibly influential in shaping the field. His emphasis on understanding religious phenomena from the perspective of the believer, his recognition that religion encompasses more than just beliefs, including rituals, myths, social structures, and experiences. And his inclusion of secular worldviews within the scope of philosophical inquiry all broaden the field significantly. He truly championed the idea that to understand any worldview, including our own, a comparative perspective is essential.
It's remarkable to see how the field has evolved from those early, sometimes implicit comparisons to these much more explicit, nuanced, and systematic approaches to acting as philosophers across cultural and religious boundaries. The entry also mentions the growing number of academic resources and platforms dedicated to this field, which really speaks to its increasing importance.
Absolutely. The emergence of conferences like the East-West Philosophers Conferences, specialized journals like Philosophy East and West and Sophia, and dedicated book series all indicate the vitality and growing recognition of comparative philosophy of religion as a crucial area of inquiry.
So we've explored how comparative philosophy of religion is defined and how it's been practiced throughout history. Now, the entry delves into different approaches within the field, those that emphasize finding common ground, synthesizing, and those that highlight the differences, heterogenizing.
Right.
This seems central to understanding the different ways we can act as philosophers in a comparative mode.
It is a fundamental distinction in how philosophers engage in the work of comparison. Synthesizing approaches are driven by the desire to identify overarching unities, shared principles, or common underlying experiences across diverse religious and philosophical traditions.
It's like trying to find the universal human quest for meaning that might be expressed in different languages and through different cultural practices.
That's the essence of it. Schopenhauer is presented as an early example of a philosopher who embraced a synthesizing approach.
Ah, okay.
He drew extensively from Platonism, Kantian philosophy, Vedanta, and Buddhism in developing his own system, seeing his work as a kind of culmination and refinement of these earlier insights, even while expressing deep admiration for the Upanishads. His approach exemplifies acting as a philosopher by drawing on a wide range of sources to construct a coherent worldview.
But even in his synthesis, he wasn't simply merging everything together. He adapted and reinterpreted ideas, like his concept of nothingness as the ultimate goal, which had nuances different from some of his Eastern sources.
So it's a creative and selective process.
Exactly. It's a form of philosophical bricolage, really building something new from existing materials. Then there's the concept of perennial philosophy,
Right, I've heard of that.
which posits the existence of a shared core of metaphysical and ethical truths underlying all the great religions, often rooted in a transcultural, mystical experience. This is a strong example of a synthesizing approach to acting as philosophers by seeking universal principles.
The entry traces the term back to Stucco, but notes its later popularization by figures like Aldous Huxley. Huxley's idea of a highest common factor at the heart of all theologies is a very direct attempt to find this underlying unity. Yes, Huxley outlined metaphysical, psychological, and ethical components of this perennial philosophy, aiming to show how seemingly disparate traditions from Christian mysticism to Hindu Upanishads and Mahayana Buddhism all point towards this fundamental reality.
Mm.
The example of reconciling the Hindu concept of Atman with the Buddhist doctrine no self through the lens of Advaita Vedanta and Mahayana thought illustrates this synthesizing impulse.
However, the entry also points out the ongoing debate around this idea, particularly with the rise of contextualist perspectives in the study of mysticism.
Oh yes, that's crucial.
Like Stephen Katz's critique and Foreman's idea of a pure consciousness event as a point of contention, it seems even the possibility of a universal mystical core is debated, reminding us that acting as philosophers involves critical engagement with these synthesizing claims.
Absolutely. Contextualists argue that mystical experiences are always shaped by the cultural, linguistic, and conceptual frameworks of the mystic, challenging the notion of a purely unmediated universal experience. It's a big debate.
And then we have religious pluralism, which the entry describes as often being the most thoroughly comparative of the synthesizing approaches. John Hick is a key figure here, proposing a parity among the major world faiths.
Right.
His work offers a specific way of acting as a philosopher by seeking to understand the diverse religious landscape as different responses to a common ultimate reality.
Yes. Hick argues that the great world faiths, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, are all equally valid paths to salvation or liberation. His idea of a single transcategorial real manifesting in different phenomenal forms, like the Trinity, Allah, or Brahman, is a powerful attempt to synthesize the diversity of religious experience while affirming a common underlying truth.
So the synthesizing approaches are all about finding that underlying unity, that common thread that runs through different religious and philosophical traditions, offering one way of acting as philosophers by identifying these shared foundations. Now, what about the heterogenizing approaches? They sound like the opposite.
Pretty much. These approaches take a different tack, deliberately emphasizing the distinct differences between religious and philosophical ideas from various traditions. Internalist pluralism, as developed by Victoria Harrison, is a key example of this.
Okay.
It offers a way of acting as philosophers by focusing on the unique conceptual frameworks that shape different religious realities.
Drawing on Putnam's idea of internal realism, the notion that what we consider real is always relative to a specific conceptual scheme.
Exactly. Harrison applies this to the study of religion, arguing that religious realities exist only within particular faith stances or conceptual frameworks. This suggests that what appear to be disagreements between different religions might actually be cases of operating within incommensurable frameworks, essentially talking past each other. The example of contrasting the Hindu deity Shiva with the Christian Trinity illustrates this point. They exist within fundamentally different conceptual worlds. For the internalist pluralist, acting as a philosopher involves understanding these distinct frameworks rather than judging them against some external standard.
So, for an internalist pluralist, the goal isn't to find out who has the true God, but to understand the concept of God as it functions within each specific religious and cultural context. Comparison, then, highlights these particularities without seeking to impose a universal metric of truth.
That's the core idea. Of course, the entry acknowledges the potential counterargument that there do seem to be genuine points of conflict and disagreement between religious traditions, and that humans across cultures do share some basic cognitive and experiential frameworks. It's not a settled issue.
And then there's radical pluralism, associated with D.Z. Phillips and influenced by Wittgenstein. This seems to take the emphasis on diversity even further, offering another perspective on acting as philosophers by focusing on the unique forms of life embodied in different traditions.
It does. Phillips views radical pluralism both as a description of the inherent diversity of the modern world and as a philosophical approach to understanding that diversity. It's comparative and non-reductive, but unlike internalist pluralism, it doesn't necessarily rely on the idea of distinct conceptual schemes.
Okay.
Instead, it emphasizes a contemplative understanding of different religious and non-religious viewpoints in their own specific context, appreciating their unique ways of making sense of the world.
So less about underlying metaphysical claims and more about understanding the different ways people live, experience, and find meaning in the world.
Precisely. Burley expands on this by incorporating insights from ethnography and literature, arguing that simply describing these diverse beliefs and practices can be a critical philosophical activity in itself, exposing the contingency of our own assumptions. And Ramal suggests that this radical pluralist approach can actually serve as a foundation for interreligious dialogue by revealing the underlying unreflective and primal religious reactions that give rise to diverse concepts. This offers a way of acting as philosophers by focusing on the fundamental human experiences that shape our beliefs.
That's a really intriguing idea that by understanding these basic human experiences, like shame or our attitudes towards the body, we might find a deeper level of connection even amidst seemingly radical differences in belief systems.
It highlights how deeply our religious and philosophical ideas are intertwined with our lived experiences and cultural contexts. It's fascinating stuff.
Now, the entry goes on to illustrate the rich potential of comparative philosophy of religion by looking at how it can be applied to the study of specific religious issues. What are some of the key areas where this comparative lens has yielded valuable insights, showing us how acting as philosophers on specific topics can be enriched by cross-cultural perspectives?
Yeah, the entry points to several important areas. One is the comparative study of personal identity, the self, and death.
Always big questions.
Absolutely. Hick's Death and Eternal Life, which surveys a wide range of conceptions of the afterlife and proposes his own synthetic view involving reincarnation, is a classic example. More recent interdisciplinary work, such as Self, No Self, explores cross-cultural perspectives on self-consciousness and its implications, particularly in the ongoing debates between Buddhist and non-Buddhist philosophical traditions. This demonstrates how acting as philosophers on the nature of the self can be profoundly informed by diverse perspectives.
That makes perfect sense. Ideas about who we are and what happens to us after death are so central to many religious and philosophical systems. Comparing how different traditions approach these fundamental questions can offer profound insights into our own understanding.
Another crucial area is comparative religious ethics. As Stolnaker points out, there are challenges in relating ethical statements across vast cultural and historical distances while still preserving their unique
Right,
meanings.
translation issues and context.
Exactly. However, the entry provides examples like Yearly's comparison of Mencius and Aquinas on the concept of virtue, Walden's analysis of compassion as a foundational moral principle in thinkers from diverse traditions, and Anne's nuanced study of Karuta in early Buddhism and Ren in Confucianism. These show how acting as philosophers in ethics can be enriched by examining different ethical frameworks.
It's not just about finding universal moral rules, but also understanding how ethical principles are conceptualized, justified, and applied within different worldviews.
Precisely. Then there's the comparative study of religion and rationality, how different traditions understand the relationship between faith, reason, and other ways of knowing. The comparison between Hume and Ramanja on natural theology, both expressing skepticism but with different epistemological foundations, is a compelling example. Similarly, the comparison of Zhuangzi and Kierkegaard on the limitations of reason highlights how different traditions grapple with the idea that ultimate truth might lie beyond the grasp of purely rational inquiry,
Interesting parallel.
suggesting different ways of acting as philosophers when engaging with the limits of reason.
That idea of anti-rationalism, not a complete rejection of reason, but a recognition of its inadequacy for grasping ultimate reality and how it manifests in both Taoism and existentialist Christianity, is fascinating.
And finally, the entry highlights the increasing importance of comparative studies involving African philosophies, using Hallen and Sadipo's collaborative analysis of Yoruba epistemological concepts as a prime example.
Okay.
Their work on concepts like knowledge, belief, and witchcraft underscores the crucial importance of understanding philosophical concepts within their specific cultural and linguistic contexts,
Right.
offering a powerful reminder of the potential for misinterpretation when we impose Western categories onto other systems of thought. This exemplifies how acting as philosophers requires sensitivity to diverse cultural frameworks.
The finding that the Yordo concept of Ajay doesn't neatly align with Western notions of witchcraft is a powerful illustration of how comparative philosophy can challenge our own taken-for-granted assumptions and broaden our understanding of fundamental concepts.
Absolutely. It demonstrates the value of comparative philosophy in revealing the cultural relativity of many of our seemingly universal categories.
So, comparative philosophy of religion offers this incredible potential for deeper understanding and a more nuanced way of acting as philosophers. But the entry also points out some significant challenges that those working in this field face. What are some of the major hurdles and ongoing debates?
Yeah, it's not without its difficulties. One of the most significant challenges discussed is the Eurocentric legacy of the field. There's a valid critique that historically, comparative philosophy of religion has often projected Western categories like God, creation, evil as universal, implicitly using Western Christianity as a kind of baseline for comparison. This can bias inquiry and overlook the unique features of non-Western traditions. This raises important questions about how we act as philosophers without imposing our own cultural frameworks.
The entry mentions Bilimorea's critique from a post-colonial perspective, which highlights this concern. It's crucial to ask whether we're inadvertently shaping our understanding of other traditions through a Western lens.
Absolutely. While the entry notes the global reach of Christianity, the point remains that Western philosophical frameworks have often dominated the field. The call for reform, for a more critical examination of our conceptual categories and a greater inclusivity of non-Western perspectives is vital for a truly global comparative philosophy.
Yeah.
The increasing use of indigenous terms like Dharma and Tao reflects this move towards decolonizing the field, so to speak.
It's about being more aware of the historical power dynamics that have shaped the field and striving for a more equitable and representative approach to philosophical inquiry. Another challenge highlighted is the potential for doing violence to the integrity of traditions
Right.
when we compare or attempt to synthesize ideas from different contexts. This raises ethical considerations for those acting as philosophers, comparatively.
This is a significant concern, particularly with synthesizing or problem-solving approaches that might extract ideas from their original, richly textured contexts. It raises questions about cultural appropriation and the importance of respecting the holistic nature of religious and philosophical systems.
A tricky territory.
It really is. While collaborative work is one way to address this, there's still a need for sensitivity and careful attention to the potential for misrepresentation or distortion when we engage with ideas across traditions. The entry even acknowledges the differing views on cultural appropriation within marginalized communities themselves, which adds another layer.
It's a delicate balancing act, wanting to learn from and engage with diverse traditions, while also being mindful of their unique historical and cultural integrity. And the entry also points out that the idea of completely isolated traditions is often inaccurate due to the entanglements of traditions throughout history.
Yeah, that's a great counterpoint.
This adds another layer of complexity to acting as philosophers, comparatively.
Exactly. Traditions have always influenced one another through trade, migration, and intellectual exchange. Recognizing these historical interconnections requires a more nuanced approach to comparison, avoiding the extremes of seeing traditions as either completely incommensurable or as simply different versions of the same underlying thing.
It's about finding that middle ground, where we acknowledge both the distinctiveness and the interconnectedness of different philosophical and religious landscapes. And finally, a very practical challenge: the immense difficulty of gaining sufficient expertise in multiple traditions to engage in truly informed comparative work.
Oh, absolutely. Clayton rightly observes that the ideal of possessing deep knowledge of several traditions is just that, an ideal. Most scholars will likely focus on more limited, often bicultural, comparisons.
That makes sense.
The academic pressures for specialization also contribute to this. However, the goal isn't necessarily for every individual to become a polymath of religious and philosophical traditions,
Right.
but rather for the field of comparative philosophy of religion to become more inclusive, welcoming diverse expertise, and fostering collaborative scholarship. It's really a collective endeavor in the pursuit of broader understanding.
So it's about expanding the conversation and bringing more diverse voices and areas of expertise into the field, even if individual scholars have their own specific areas of focus.
Precisely. Build the collective knowledge.
Well, this has been a truly illuminating deep dive into the fascinating world of comparative philosophy of religion. It's clear that this field, in its various forms, offers a powerful and essential way of acting as philosophers by actively engaging with a multitude of perspectives, both across time and across cultures.
Absolutely. As we've explored, it's not merely about listing differences or superficial similarities. It's about delving into the underlying assumptions, the historical trajectories, and the cultural contexts that shape philosophical and religious thought, ultimately enriching our own philosophical understanding.
And for you, our listener, we hope this exploration of comparative methods and historical examples provides you with a richer and more critical perspective on philosophical inquiry itself. You can begin to act as philosophers in this comparative mode by actively considering multiple viewpoints and the historical and cultural forces that have shaped them in your own thinking.
Yeah, and this raises a crucial question for you to maybe ponder. Consider a belief or idea that you hold dear. How might exploring a different philosophical or religious tradition's perspective on that same issue challenge your own understanding, potentially revealing new dimensions or raising entirely new questions that you hadn't considered before?
It's definitely food for thought, and this deep dive is really just the beginning.
Mhm.
We encourage you to delve further into the thinkers and topics we've touched upon that particularly sparked your interest. Thank you for sharing your intellectual curiosity and this thought-provoking set of sources with us.
Indeed. It's through this kind of open-minded exploration and engagement with diverse perspectives that we can truly deepen our understanding of the complex tapestry of human thought and, well, our place within it.